A 62-year-old widow stood inside a tilting cabin wedged between granite boulders at 8,000 feet, and she pressed both palms against the back wall, and the wall answered with a sound that should not have been there. A deep, hollow echo, round and wide, rolling out from behind the wood like a breath held for decades, the kind of echo that only comes from empty space. And the only thing that should have been behind that wall was solid rock. People in her late husband's family had looked at her across the lawyer's table with an expression she did not need a dictionary to translate. She got the worst of it. But what none of them knew, what none of them could have guessed, was that the worst of it had been keeping a secret for 25 years, and she had just knocked on its door. Before we go on, if stories like this one mean something to you, stories about what people find when they stop waiting for permission to begin, take a moment and subscribe. It costs nothing, and it means this voice gets to keep telling these kinds of stories. That is all. Now back to the cabin and back to the echo. There is a thing nobody tells you about losing people in pieces. They do not tell you because most people lose all at once, and all at once is a different country with its own customs and its own mercy. When you lose all at once, the world stops for you. Casseroles arrive. Neighbors sit on your porch and hold your hand and say nothing. Because nothing is the only honest thing to say, and somehow the weight of their silence feels like a blanket, ugly but warm. But when you lose in pieces first the child, then the husband, then the house that was never in your name, then the quiet assumption that someone somewhere would extend a hand without wanting something in return, there is no blanket. There is just you sitting on the edge of a bed that does not belong to you. Counting days the way you count coins at the bottom of a pocket with a hole in it. Hattie Calder learned this the way she learned most things. Not from books, though she had spent 30 years surrounded by them. From the particular curriculum that life reserves for the students it intends to test hardest. She was 62 years old. She had a face that people described as serious when they were being kind and closed when they were not. Her hands were calloused in places that did not match her profession because a school librarian who also gardens and also paints the trim on the house and also fixes the screen door. Because her husband is away surveying some ridgeline in the back country, ends up with hands that tell a longer story than her job title suggests. Her shoulders carried a slight forward curve, the posture of someone who has spent years leaning into things that were heavier than they looked. And her eyes were brown and deep, the kind her mother used to say saw too much for their own good. Her mother died when Hattie was 24. Her son Calvin died when he was 10. Leukemia, the kind that moves through a child's body, with a patience that mocks every urgent prayer sent against it. Her husband, Walter, died 3 years ago, a stroke at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning. In November, mid-sentence, mid-coffee, mid-life in every way that mattered. But all of that is the before. The story that matters begins on a Thursday afternoon in a small office that smelled of old paper and carpet cleaner, in a building on the main street of Ridge Rock, Colorado, with a lawyer named Garrett Howe, reading a will that no one expected to contain any surprises, and Hattie sitting in the farthest chair from the table, her hands folded in her lap, waiting to hear what everyone else already seemed to know. The office held 7 people besides Hattie. Walter's brother Boyd, thick-armed and restless, already wearing the expression of a man who had calculated his share and found it satisfactory. Boyd's wife Charlene, who kept her purse on her lap like a shield. 2 cousins Hattie barely knew, men who had arrived with the specific energy of people who knew exactly how much they expected to receive. Walter's sister Delia, who had the particular talent of making every room she entered feel slightly colder, and 2 representatives from a farm equipment company who were there for reasons Hattie did not yet understand. Garrett Howe read the will with the measured voice of a man who had read enough of these to know that the words themselves mattered less than the silences between them. The farmhouse and 40 acres in the valley went to Boyd. The equipment was split among the cousins. The old Ford pickup, which Walter had loved more than almost anything in this world, went to Boyd's eldest son, who already had the keys in his pocket before the sentence was finished. Then the lawyer reached Hattie's name. He cleared his throat. She noticed. No one else noticed, but she did, because she had spent a lifetime in a library learning to hear the sounds that happened between the louder sounds, the small signals that most people talked over. To my wife, Hattie June Calder. He read slower than he had read any of the other portions. Is left the property registered under the following parcel number. And here he cited a number she had never heard in her life. Located on Briar Ridge, unincorporated Dahlgren County, Colorado, including the existing structure and the surrounding acreage as delineated in the attached survey. Silence. Then the silence became something else. She felt it move through the room like a weather change. Delia's eyes found hers for a fraction of a second, and the expression in them did not require translation. Boyd almost smiled, but caught himself. The two cousins looked at their own hands with the practiced disinterest of men who had been expecting exactly this and were relieved it was not worse. For them, she got the worst of it. That was what the room said without saying it. Hattie did not know Briar Ridge. Walter had never spoken of any Briar Ridge. In 35 years of marriage, of conversations at the kitchen table, of quiet evenings on the porch, watching the collegiate peaks turn orange and then purple and then dark, of long drives on dirt roads, where he pointed out geological formations with the enthusiasm of a man who loved the shape of the earth, the way other men loved football. He had never once pointed at a ridge and said, "This one is mine." The property had been registered in Walter's name for 25 years, which meant he had acquired it before they were married. A place he had kept in silence for more than 2 decades, through the birth of their son, through Calvin's illness, through the funeral where Walter stood so still that she thought for a moment he had turned to stone, through every year after, through his own death. He had carried this secret the way granite carries the mineral deposits inside it. Invisible on the surface, present in every layer. She should have been angry. Sometimes in the days that followed, lying on the narrow bed in the back room of her cousin Pearl's house in Ridge Rock, she waited for the anger to arrive the way you wait for a storm that the forecast promised. But instead of anger, what came was curiosity, a quiet, almost archaeological interest. What is this place? Why did he keep it? What did he know about it that I do not know? Pearl's house was small and kind and full. Pearl and her husband Dale had 3 grandchildren living with them temporarily, which meant permanently in the way that temporary arrangements in families always do, and a dog the size of a small horse that occupied the hallway with the confidence of a creature who knew its position was secure. Hattie slept in the sewing room on a fold-out cot that squeaked every time she turned. She was grateful. Gratitude and discomfort lived in the same room, and she had learned not to expect them to take turns. Pearl asked her one evening, while Hattie was sitting on the porch step going through the documents from Garrett Howe's office, what she planned to do with the property. Hattie said she was still thinking. Pearl was quiet for a moment and then said, with the careful gentleness of someone who means well, but also means what she's saying, that Dale's mother was coming for an extended visit, and the sewing room would be needed soon. It was not an eviction, it was a reminder. But reminders and evictions arrive at the same destination, just at different speeds. She packed in 2 hours. There was not much. Clothes that fit in one suitcase, a cast iron skillet that had been hers before the marriage, a wool blanket from a better time, a flashlight that Pearl insisted she take, her documents in a plastic folder, and the photograph of Walter that she kept in an empty matchbox because it was the only container that did not crease it. Pearl's husband Dale drove her to the trailhead, where the dirt road turned into something a sedan could no longer manage. The morning was early, the sun still below the peaks, and there was a thin cold that the wind stretched between the aspens on either side of the road. He stopped the truck and helped her lift the bags from the bed. He tried to say something, failed twice. Succeeded on the third attempt the way people do when the words they need are simple but heavy. Hattie, if you need anything, I know, she said. Thank you, Dale. He drove away. She watched the dust settle behind the truck until there was nothing left of it. Then she picked up her bags and started walking. The road climbed gradually, switching back through stands of aspen and ponderosa pine, with granite outcroppings appearing on both sides, like the bones of the mountain pushing through its skin. It took her over an hour to reach the point where the road gave way to a foot trail, and from there it was another 20 minutes of climbing between boulders and scrub oak, with her bad knee reminding her at every step that it had opinions about this plan. When she reached the cabin, she stopped. It was smaller than she had imagined. Smaller and more crooked and more embedded in the rock than any picture she had tried to assemble in her mind during those days at Pearl's house. The cabin looked as though the ridge had decided to grow around it, embracing its walls, reclaiming its edges. The wood was dark with age and altitude. The roof was low old cedar shakes gone silver, and the door had an iron latch that stuck but opened. She opened it. The smell entered first. Closed earth, old dust, and something she could not name immediately, but later recognized as wood, that had been keeping silence for a very long time. The interior was a single room, dim, with one small window on the east side that let in a narrow blade of light. The floor was rough planking, uneven with gaps where the wind would come through at night. A crude shelf on one wall, a rusted hook on the back wall where a straw hat still hung, as if its owner had just stepped out and intended to return. She stood in the doorway for a time she did not measure. The valley opened below through the aspens when she turned her head. The air at this elevation was different from any air she had breathed in years, thin and clean and alive with something that had no name but that her lungs recognized before her mind did. She did not romanticize. She was a woman who had been tired too long to romanticize anything. But she looked at the cabin, and she looked at the valley, and she made the simple calculation she always made when facing a decision that frightened her. Can I survive here? The answer was not comfortable, but it was possible. And possible for Hattie had always been enough to begin. She brought her bags inside, closed the door, hung the flashlight on the hook where the old hat had been, sat on the plank floor with her back against the cold stone wall. And she did what she had done since she was a girl, whenever the world became too large and too loud and too much. She took a piece of paper from her folder, and she made a list. The lists had calmed her since childhood, not because they solve things. They do not solve things, but because they take what feels enormous and uncontrollable and break it into pieces that fit on paper. And what fits on paper fits in your head. And what fits in your head can be done. One item at a time. She wrote by the fading light through the window. Water source, firewood, food for the week, gaps in the floor, the east window latch, kerosene for a lantern if she could find one. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, the paper in front of her did not make her afraid. It made her feel something she almost did not recognize, so unfamiliar had it become. A small hope. Not the kind that promises easy happiness, the kind that knows there will be hard work and bad days ahead, and still prefers to keep going rather than stop. She folded the paper, lay down on the blanket she had spread over the plank floor, closed her eyes. Outside, the wind moved through the granite with a sound like breathing slow and old, and she listened to it until she slept. The first 2 days were the kind of work that appears on no list and earns no recognition. The work of making a place habitable, not comfortable. Comfortable is a different scale, a different budget, a different life. Habitable, the kind of arrangement that means it is possible to spend the night here without being defeated by cold or dirt or fear. She swept the cobwebs with a pine branch. She stuffed the worst floor gaps with strips of cloth she tore from an old shirt. She wedged plastic sheeting into the wall cracks where the wind entered like a whisper that would not stop. On her first trip down to Ridge Rock to the general store run by a man named Fenton Moss, she bought kerosene matches, rice beans, salt, and a 10-gallon plastic bucket. She hung the lantern she found in Fenton's backstock from a wire in the center of the ceiling. And when she lit it that evening, the light was amber and unsteady and alive in a way that electric light never is. Fenton Moss was a man of about 68, with the broad shoulders of someone who had done physical work for most of his life, and the small watchful eyes of someone who registered everything but revealed nothing. When she introduced herself as Walter Calder's widow, he looked at her for several seconds with an expression she could not read. Then he nodded once slowly, the way a person confirms information they already had, but were not certain was correct. "I knew Walter," he said, "long time back." He did not add anything. She did not ask him to. She learned the rhythm of the ridge. The way you learn anything when you are alone in a place and the place is your only teacher. The hours of the sun, the times the wind shifted direction, the sounds that belonged there and the sounds that did not. There was a Steller's jay in a ponderosa on the southeast slope that appeared at the same times each day, just after dawn and again near dusk, and was silent in between. The midday quiet on the ridge was different from every other quiet dancer, warmer, filled with the low hum of insects she could never locate. It was on the third evening that she heard the sound. She was reorganizing the interior of the cabin, trying to create something functional from the almost nothing that existed. The shelf would hold food. The corner near the window would be for sitting during the day where the light was best. The back wall where the old hat had hung would hold tools and the bucket. She wanted to shift the sleeping area slightly, to pull the blanket a few inches from the back wall so she could lie without her head touching the stone. The cabin was too narrow for any other arrangement. She placed both palms flat against the back wall and pushed. The wood groaned. That was normal. All the wood groans when it is asked to move after years of staying still. But what came after the groan was not normal. It was an echo, deep round, rolling out from inside the wall with a quality that did not match what should have been on the other side. Solid granite, firm and massive. She had seen it from outside. The rock of the ridge pressed against the cabin's back wall, as if it had tried to swallow the structure and gotten halfway before losing interest. But an echo like that does not come from solid stone. An echo like that comes from empty space. She pushed again, harder, at a different point. The echo returned, larger, clearer. She ran the flashlight slowly along the entire surface of the wall, top to bottom, side to side. The wood was dark and uniform with rusted nails in horizontal rows, but at one specific point, roughly center at the height of her hip. The nails were slightly different, not rusted the same way, cleaner, as if they had been removed and replaced at some point more recent than everything around them. She found a flathead screwdriver on the shelf among loose screws and a piece of rope. She began to work the boards loose, carefully, not with haste, because she did not know what she was doing and wanted the option of putting things back. The first board came free more easily than she expected. It was not nailed firmly. It was fitted like a lid disguised as a wall. The second board came with it, joined underneath in a tongue and groove joint that someone had made with skill, and then hidden behind a surface that looked ordinary from the front. When the boards were out, she crouched and aimed the flashlight into the opening. Behind the wall was a cavity in the rock, not large, not the kind of thing that opens into a vast illuminated chamber. It was a recess in the granite, a natural pocket that someone had widened with tools and then sealed with wood, creating a space perhaps 5 feet deep and 3 feet wide enough to enter, if you crouched and did not mind the cold stone pressing close on every side. The ceiling of the space was raw rock irregular, with the fine roots that had found their way through the granite and hung like threads. The air that came out was dry. That surprised her. Outside moisture entered everywhere. But inside this space, the air was dry the way the inside of a sealed chest is dry. She entered. She had to turn sideways, the flashlight extended ahead. The floor of the cavity was stone that someone had leveled. Someone had worked here, had chipped away the rough spots and smoothed the surface enough to set things down without them falling over. And there were things. Against the back wall of the cavity, a metal box, rectangular, the kind that used to be called a toolbox, with two side latches and a handle on top. Beside it, pinned to the stone with a thick nail, 3 photographs. And on the other side, wrapped in a folded cotton cloth, tools, a wood chisel, a small stone carving pick, a folding knife with a bone handle. Tools she recognized before she understood why she recognized them. And then she understood. They were Walter's. She took the photographs first. The first showed a young man, very young, maybe 25, smiling at the camera with the smile she knew by heart. Wide on the right side, restrained on the left, as if part of him always distrusted cameras. He stood between 2 men she had never seen. All 3 in work clothes, arms sundark and the late afternoon light hitting them from the side. Behind them was the ridge. This ridge. The rock formations she recognized now. The stepped granite above the cabin. The second photograph was Walter alone, sitting on a fallen log, a tin cup in his hands, looking toward the horizon with that expression he had when he was thinking hard and did not want anyone to know he was thinking. She had seen that look for 35 years and never found a name for it. Now, holding the photo in the dark of the cavity, she realized it was the look of someone keeping something. The third photograph stopped her. It was her. Younger, maybe 7 or 8 years ago, seen from behind looking at a dirt road. She did not know this photograph existed, did not know anyone had taken it, did not know he had kept it here in this place with the gold and the tools and the images of his younger self. She held that third photograph for a long time. She could not see her own face. Only her back, her shoulders with their slight forward curve, her head tilted to one side, the way she always tilted it when she was thinking. But there was something in that image that pressed against her chest in a way she was not prepared for. It was the posture of someone resisting, not winning, resisting. And he had seen that in her, and captured it and carried it to this hidden place, and kept it as if it were the most valuable thing he owned. She opened the metal box. The latches were not locked, just pressure fit, the old kind that close with a click. Inside the box was lined with a folded piece of leather that had protected the contents from moisture. The coins were there. 23 of them. Gold, the old kind that rural people kept before banks, before savings accounts, before all the systems the modern world invented to replace trust in metal. Some were genuinely old with markings she could not read in the dim light. Others were more recent, the kind that cautious people bought at trade fairs as a hedge against uncertain times. She did not know how to appraise gold, but she knew enough to know that 23 gold coins, even the smallest ones, represented an amount that changed what was possible for her. Not a fortune, not the kind of thing that solves everything overnight. The kind of thing that used carefully buys time. And time when you are starting from zero is worth more than gold, or at least as much. She sat on the cold stone floor of the cavity with the box in her lap and the photographs in her hand. Walter had been dead for 3 years. During all of that time, she had asked herself many questions about what he knew that she did not know, about what he had planned, and never told her about his silences that she had interpreted as reserve, and that she was now beginning to see from a different angle. I was not a man of many words, but he was also not a man who left holes unfilled. He planned in a way that looked like carelessness to anyone who did not know him, but that was actually the patience of a builder, the kind of person who lays the foundation before mentioning the house. She examined the feeling carefully. The way she examined all emotions that arrived without warning to make sure she was not confusing one thing with another. It was not anger. It was a very specific kind of sadness, the kind that does not shout, the sadness of realizing that someone knew you so well that they prepared a path for you without needing to explain why, because they knew you would only understand when you arrived. And that someone was no longer here to see you arrive. She placed the photographs back. She was about to leave the cavity when the flashlight caught something she had missed. Wedged into a narrow horizontal crack in the stone wall at chest height. Wrapped in coarse cotton cloth tied with a double knot she recognized immediately. Because Walter had taught her that knot one Sunday evening, when there was nothing more urgent than sitting in the yard and learning to tie knots. This one never comes loose, he had said. Pull it from any direction and it holds. She untied the knot carefully. Inside the cloth was a small notebook, black hardcover pocket size, the kind you used to buy at the stationery stores in small towns. The pages had yellowed, but the ink was legible. Walter's handwriting unmistakable, small and tilted to the left. The way he always joked was the defect of a left-handed man. It was not a diary. She wanted to be clear about that in her own mind because for the first minutes she almost read it that way. Expecting feelings, explanations, the words he never said aloud. But it was not that. It was something that took her time to categorize. And when she did, she sat on the cold stone for a long while, just processing what she had in her hands. It was a manual of the ridge written with the precision of someone who knew every foot of a place and wanted that knowledge to survive, regardless of who was there to pass it on. The entries were organized not by calendar dates, but by cycles. First, the snow of the season. Fill both stone basins before the east bank slides. August Angiko wood does not burn well wet. Wait 2 weeks after cutting. Long winter, the North Trail gets slick on the flat rock. Walk the edge. There was a hand-drawn map that covered 2 full pages. Not a beautiful map, a functional one. The ridge drawn in approximate contour lines with important points marked in circles. The cabin. The main spring. A second spring she had not yet found. An area on the east side marked good soil goes deep, and a point at the top of the ridge marked with a simple X-no annotation. And then there were notes about the land itself, not observations about weather or water, notes about an agreement. 3 names, 3 shares, and a sentence that made her stop breathing for a moment. Dalton will not let it go. Came back with new papers, says the old deal is void because the law changed. I know the law did not change anything. That changes what we agreed. What changed is he thought I would accept. I will not accept. The land is split 3 ways, always was. And as long as I am alive, nobody signs anything that undoes that. Everett is afraid of him, always has been. But Everett's fear is not my problem. My problem is making sure that if one day I am not here, the land stays with whoever has the right to it. I will register everything I can. Register and store what cannot be registered in a place only the person who needs it will find. She read it twice. Dalton, Everett, Walter. 3 men, 1 piece of land, an agreement made decades ago that someone wanted to break. She turned back to the first photograph. The 2 men standing with the young Walter on this ridge. She turned it over. On the back in Walter's handwriting, faded pencil, Dalton, me, Everett, Briar Ridge, April 1982. April 1882. Walter was 26 years old. Already on this ridge, with 2 men recording the moment with a photograph he would later hide in a cavity that would take more than 30 years to be found. She placed the notebook inside her coat. She would not leave it in the cavity. She needed it close, needed to keep reading, needed to understand the rest of what Walter had written over what appeared to be 15 years of entries. She replaced the wall boards with movements that her hands were already learning to remember. Second board the first, then the first fitted from the left. She went to the window and looked out at the valley. The sun was dropping toward the western peaks, and the entire horizon was the color of old copper. Ridge Rock appeared below as a small cluster of rooftops, with the white steeple of the community church rising slightly above the rest. The dirt road that descended from the ridge was empty. The jay in the ponderosa called 3 times its evening schedule and then went quiet. She stood there and thought, the only thought that mattered. What do I do now? It was not a desperate question. It was a practical one. She had a place. She had water. She had a reserve that gave her room to plan. She had time, which was what she needed most to do anything right. What she did not have was enough food for more than a few days' tools in working condition, or any relationship with the people in the town below that could become a network of support over time. Those were the gaps. That was the map of what needed to be done. Then Fenton Mosso sent a word up the ridge with a boy from town who sometimes carried deliveries, a note written in Fenton's square, unhurried hand on the back of a receipt. Man came asking about Briar Ridge, asked who was living up there, did not give a name, drove a dark truck, came twice. Hattie read the note, standing in the doorway of the cabin with the last light of the day falling across the granite around her. She read it again. Then she folded it and placed it in her coat pocket next to the notebook. She went inside, closed the door. The iron latch stuck as it always did, and she worked it into place with the small sideways pressure. She was learning was required. She did not light the lantern. She sat in the dark for several minutes. Not because she was afraid. She had explained the difference to herself a long time ago in a hospital room where her son was dying, and fear would have consumed every useful minute she had left with him. Fear paralyzes, alertness organizes. She had chosen alertness then, and she chose it now. She took the paper from her folder. She made a list. Water secured, shelter functional, gold hidden and counted. Documents in the plastic folder. Notebook read partially more to come. Fenton informed and watchful. Stranger asking questions, unknown identity, unknown purpose. Next step, the county clerk's office. She wrote each item with the steady hand of a woman who had discovered that the cabin everyone said was the worst piece of a bad inheritance was in fact exactly what her husband had intended her to have. Not a place to shelter, a place to stand. There was an enormous difference between the two, and she was only beginning to understand what that difference meant. She folded the list, placed it inside the notebook between the pages where Walter's handwriting ended and the blank pages began. Then she lay down on the wool blanket with her coat still on because the night was coming, and the cold at this elevation did not wait for permission. Outside, the wind moved through the granite of Briar Ridge with its slow, ancient sound. And somewhere below, in a dark truck that had come twice and left twice without giving a name, someone was watching the ridge and wondering who was up there and what she knew. She closed her eyes. She did not know yet what she knew, but she was learning. And for a woman who had spent 30 years in a library, learning had always been the thing she trusted most. She slept. The ridge breathed around her, and the notebook lay against her chest. Walter's words pressed close to the place where her heart was still after everything beating. The dog appeared on the trail on her fourth morning during the second trip down to the spring she had found by following the contour lines on Walter's map. It was standing 15 yards ahead of her, motionless, watching her, with its head tilted slightly to one side. Medium size, tending toward large, short-coated, the color of the granite around them. That particular brown-gray that dogs in mountain country seemed to absorb from the landscape as if they were born from the soil itself. Thin in a way that was not breed. Thin in a way that was hunger, the kind that has been going on long enough to become architecture, ribs visible beneath the coat when the animal breathed deep. But the eyes were not the eyes of a beaten dog. They were not submissive, not aggressive, not anxious. They were assessing. She did nothing. No sudden movement, no call, no offering. She had learned a long time ago in a children's library where frightened 6-year-old arrived on the first day of school, with the same wide-eyed uncertainty that the first thing a scared creature needs is to see that you will not move too fast. After that, they decide for themselves. The dog watched her. She watched the dog. Then she reached slowly into her pack and tore a piece of the biscuit she had been saving for the descent, placed half on a flat rock in front of her, stepped back 2 paces, sat down on a boulder, turned her face slightly away because direct eye contact with an animal that does not know you is a challenge, and she was not interested in challenging anyone. 2 minutes passed. The dog advanced, took the biscuit with a quickness that was not greedy but efficient, and retreated to exactly the position it had held before. It chewed without taking its eyes off her. She left the other half in her pocket and continued up the trail. When she looked back 50 yards later, the dog was following. The distance was respectful, maybe 20 yards, but the following was intentional, not a coincidence of direction. She did not name it that day. She kept the name inside for a while before speaking it, but she knew what it was the moment she saw it standing on the trail, as though it had calculated the exact time she would pass. Flint, because it was the color of the stone that sparks when struck, because it had appeared with the same hard patience that everything on this ridge seemed to carry. Over the next 2 weeks, Flint moved closer in layers, first outside the boulder perimeter, then inside it but outside the cabin door, then on the threshold lying across it at night, as though he had chosen that position and saw no reason to change. He never barked when something moved on the trail or in the brush. He stood ears forward, muzzle raised, reading the air, and that posture was enough. He understood that silence on this ridge was a resource and should not be wasted. The first time he led her somewhere she had not planned to go was on a morning when she was heading to the main spring. He stopped at a fork in the trail and went left instead of right. She paused. He looked at her. Then he continued. She followed. The trail he took was steeper and narrower, climbing through larger boulders on the north face. 15 minutes of difficult walking, her knee objecting at every uneven step, until the trail opened onto a granite ledge that jutted over the valley like a natural balcony. The view from there was entirely different from the view at the cabin. You could see the full curve of the ridge rock in the distance, and beyond it the dark line of a spruce forest that marked the edge of the national forest boundary. But the view was not what Flint had brought her to see. Below the ledge, protected by the overhang of rock above it, was a second spring, smaller than the main one, but shielded from exposure in a way the first was not. In a dry year, the main spring could diminish. This one, fed by a different layer of the aquifer and sheltered by the granite above, would hold longer. She sat on the ledge and looked at him. He was sitting at the edge, gazing at the valley with complete indifference to her surprise. He had known this spring before she arrived. He knew the ridge before she did, and he had decided for reasons that belonged entirely to him to share what he knew. She began going to the Saturday market in Ridge Rock during the second week. The market was small, set up in the gravel lot beside the community church, with a handful of tables under canopies that flapped in the mountain wind. It was the kind of market where conversation started in the middle because everyone already knew the beginning. And what was exchanged was not just produce, but the daily information that keeps a small place functioning. Ada Birch sold the herbs and vegetables from a table at the far end, beneath a faded green canopy that had clearly survived more seasons than it was designed for. She was in her early 60s, with white hair pulled back in a low knot, and the hands of someone who plants and harvests with precision. The fingers that know the difference between a seedling ready for transplanting and one that needs another week. When Hattie bought parsley and a bundle of kale on her second visit, Ada asked where she had come from. Hattie answered with the truth she had settled on as her standard introduction. Widow. Inherited the cabin on Briar Ridge. Trying to establish herself. Ada listened without interrupting. Then she asked if Hattie had tried growing anything yet. She said she had started, but the soil near the rocks was shallow and difficult. Ada nodded with the expression of someone who knew that problem intimately. Then, without ceremony, without making it feel like charity, she said she could show Hattie where the soil on the ridge tended to run deeper and how to work compost into what was there to correct the deficiencies. In exchange, if Hattie could help carry the heavy seed bags on delivery days, that would be good for Ada, whose shoulder had been bad for years. It was not friendship yet. It was the beginning of a useful coexistence, which is often the most honest way a real friendship starts. Ada came up the ridge on a Tuesday. She walked the perimeter of the cabin, studying the ground the way a doctor studies a patient, looking for symptoms before making a diagnosis. She pointed to a flat area southeast of the cabin where the soil was darker and deeper, protected from the worst wind by a wall of boulders. She knelt and worked the dirt through her fingers and said one word, "Here." Then she showed Hattie how to layer the compost she had been building from kitchen scraps and dead leaves, alternating wet and dry, turning it with a stick every few days. The lesson lasted 2 hours. Ada did not stay for tea because there was no tea to offer. But she accepted a cup of water from the spring and drank it standing looking at the valley with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has done a useful thing and does not need it acknowledged. Hattie planted kale, garlic, and onion sets that Ada brought on a second visit. The garlic went into the southeast plot where the soil was deepest. Within 2 weeks, the first green shoots appeared, thin and tentative, pushing through the dark earth with a stubbornness that Hattie recognized because it was her own. Fenton Moss began setting aside things for her without being asked. A box of candles when the kerosene ran low, a bag of oats that he said was overstocked, and would she do him a favor and take it? She understood the economy of these gestures. They were not charity. They were the quiet way a small community begins to fold a new person into its fabric, testing the thread before committing to the weave. It was during this period, while the rhythm of the ridge was becoming something her body understood as well as her mind, that she went to the county clerk's office in Ridge Rock. The office occupied a room in the back of the old courthouse, a stone building with high windows and the particular silence of places where records are kept. Behind the counter sat a woman who looked as though she had been placed there by the same geological forces that had placed the granite on the ridge. Opal Dunning was perhaps 75, with short white hair, thin-framed glasses on a beaded chain, and the penmanship so precise it looked typeset. She did not look up when Hattie entered. She finished the line she was writing, set the pen down with care, and only then raised her eyes above the glasses. Hattie introduced herself and stated her purpose. She needed to verify the registration records for the Briar Ridge parcel, specifically the condominium arrangement between 3 owners. Opal studied her for a long second. Then she rose without a word, went to a high shelf at the back of the room, and pulled a ledger with the certainty of someone who did not need to search, because the archive was an extension of her own memory. She opened it to a specific page, read for a moment, and then looked at Hattie again. "Mrs. Calder." Her voice carried a careful weight that had not been there a moment before. "Are you aware that this parcel has a situation that is not simple?" "I am learning," Hattie said. Opal closed the ledger, slowly kept her hand on the cover for a moment, and then said something Hattie had not expected to hear. "Your husband came here 6 years ago. He asked me to hold a sealed envelope in his name to be delivered only to his wife Hattie in the event of his death." She paused. I held it. The silence in the clerk's office was different from every other silence Hattie had known in the weeks since she arrived on the ridge. It was the silence of something about to change shape. "I am her," Hattie said. Opal nodded once, rose, went to a cabinet in the corner that required a key she wore on the beaded chain with her glasses, returned with a white envelope standard size with 2 words written on the front in Walter's handwriting, "For Hattie." She did not open it there. She could not explain exactly why. There was a part of her that knew what was inside that envelope would change something. and the extent of the change she did not yet know. But she felt that it was the kind of change that needed the right place to be received. A county clerk's office was not that place. She signed a receipt that Opal prepared in the ledger. They each kept a copy. Then Opal returned to her chair, picked up her pen, and resumed the line she had interrupted, as though the world could be organized into complete lines with the periods in the right places. Opal Hattie said before leaving, "Has anyone else come to this office asking about the Briar Ridge parcel?" Opal did not look up from the ledger. "No one has inquired about the Briar Ridge parcel at this office." The clarity of her voice was simultaneously an answer and a message. What was in these records stayed in these records, and the keeping of that information was her responsibility, not the business of anyone who showed up with questions. "Thank you," Hattie said. "Good day, Mrs. Calder." She climbed the ridge faster than she usually climbed. Flint met her at the fork in the trail, appearing from behind a boulder, as though he had timed her absence and positioned himself at the point where she would arrive. He did that sometimes. She never knew if it was scent intuition or simply that he knew her rhythms better than she knew them herself. She entered the cabin, closed the door, sat on the floor with her back against the side wall, and placed the envelope in her lap. The quality of the moment was strange and specific. The feeling that what was inside this envelope was a conversation Walter had started years ago in silence, knowing she would only hear it when he could no longer be present to explain. She opened it. 2 documents and a letter. She took the letter first. 3 pages of graph paper, the handwriting smaller than usual. The way a person writes when there is much to say and not enough paper. No date, no greeting. Direct the way Walter spoke when the matter was serious. "Hattie, if you are reading this, it means I did not have time to tell you in person, and I regret not having told you sooner. I will explain as clearly as I can." She breathed in, she read. What the letter explained. She processed in her own words because some things belong to the person who wrote them, and she would not reproduce what was his. In 1989, Walter, Dalton, Briggs, and Everett Poole, 3 young men who had worked together on a survey crew in the backcountry for 2 seasons, had found the Briar Ridge area during a weekend hike. The land was unregistered, unclaimed part of an old mining claim that had lapsed decades earlier. The 3 of them had done what people did with unclaimed land in that era in that part of Colorado. They filed a joint claim, improved the property, and when the federal land patent process allowed it, they formalized their ownership, 1/3 each. The arrangement held for years without trouble. The 3 had their lives in different places. The ridge sat in its silence. The agreement was simple. Nobody sells without consulting the other 2. If someone wants out, the others have first right of refusal. The trouble began when a mining company started acquiring mineral rights in the area around Briar Ridge. Low-grade ore, the kind that was not worth extracting at small scale, but could be profitable for a large operation. The company approached landowners with purchase offers. Dalton was the first to be contacted. And unlike Walter and Everett, Dalton wanted to sell. "Dalton has always been this way," Walter wrote. "Sees the money before he sees anything else. It is not malice in him, it is just how he is built. But this time, the money he saw was large enough to make him act in a way I cannot easily forgive." What Dalton did was present the company's offer to Everett, as inevitable as already agreed upon, as a formality that just needed signatures. Everett, who had been afraid of Dalton since the survey crew days. Walter did not explain why, just recorded the fear as fact, initially agreed. But before signing, Everett called Walter. And Walter went to the county clerk, consulted Opal Dunning, and discovered that the company's acquisition strategy required all 3 owners to sign jointly. Without Walter's signature, the sale could not proceed. Walter refused, always, until the end. The letter closed with a sentence she read 3 times. "The ridge is yours now, and it holds more than it appears to hold." Do not sell to anyone. What is in the cavity and what is at Opal's office together is enough for you to hold what is yours. Trust Opal. Trust yourself. That is the most important part. She folded the letter and sat with it for a time she did not count. The second document was a copy of the joint registration, 3 names, 3 signatures. The division into thirds clearly specified. The third document was a letter from a lawyer in Denver, not the one who had read the will dated 4 years earlier, explaining in legal language what Walter had explained in personal language, that the sale of the jointly held parcel required the consent of all co-owners, and that one owner's refusal constituted sufficient legal impediment to block any transaction. She placed everything back in the envelope. She placed the envelope inside the plastic folder with the other documents. Then she stayed on the floor of the cabin with her hands flat on the rough planking and her eyes open in the dim light. And she let the feeling arrive without trying to name it or shape it or rush it into something manageable. Somewhere in the cavity behind the wall, pinned to cold stone, was a photograph of her, taken from behind, standing on a road, shoulders curved forward, resisting. He had kept that image alongside the gold and the documents as though her endurance was the most valuable thing in the collection. She understood now why he had placed it there, not as a record of who she was, as a reminder of what she was capable of. It was not anger, it was not gratitude. It was not love, though love was in it. It was the particular weight of understanding that someone had known her completely enough to build a road for her through a future he would not be there to walk, and had done it without asking whether she wanted the road, because he knew she would only recognize she needed it when she was already standing on it with nowhere else to go. I knew I would not ask for help, she thought. He knew I would not be able to stay anywhere that depended on someone else's goodwill. He knew that sooner or later I would need a place that was mine, not borrowed, not temporary, not conditional. And he prepared it 25 years before I needed it with a foresight so extravagant it could only be called love. She did not cry, but there was a moment sitting on the plank floor with the envelope in her lap, and Flint lying near the door watching her with his steady gaze, when she breathed differently, deeper, slower, the way a person breathes when they find solid ground after a long time of walking without it. The following morning, she went down to Ridge Rock and called the Denver lawyer from the payphone outside Fenton's store. The lawyer's name was on the letterhead of the document Walter had left. A young woman answered, took her message, noted the urgency. Hattie left Fenton's store number as her contact. Fenton, who had been listening from behind the counter without pretending otherwise, gave the number without hesitation. 3 days later, Fenton sent word up the ridge. The lawyer had called back. Could see her the following week. She went. She brought the notebook, the envelope documents, the registration copy, and the notice she had written during the 3 days between the call and the meeting. She explained everything in order, not chronological order, but the order that made the connections visible, because chronological order sometimes hides what matters by burying the motive between the facts. The lawyer listened, asked precise questions, examined the notebook with an attention that told her he understood the value of what he was holding. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Mrs. Calder, your position is stronger than it probably feels to you right now. The joint registration is clear. Walter's documented refusals over the years recorded in this notebook, with approximate dates and details, are exactly the kind of evidence that protects a co-owner from undue pressure. Your third transferred through the estate is legitimate and protected. She asked about Everett. The lawyer said that needed to be verified. But even if Everett had sold it, would not affect her third. She asked how long resolution might take. It depended on how the other side responded. I do not want to sell, she said with a clarity that surprised even her. Then you do not sell. That is your right. She returned to the ridge that afternoon. Dalton Briggs was waiting. I had not climbed all the way to the cabin. He was standing at the point where the trail leveled off before the final approach, leaning against a boulder, with the posture of a man who wanted to appear casual and had practiced the lean, tall mid-60s silver hair cut short. Wearing clothes that were calculated to look accessible without surrendering the message that he had resources. A shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow. Good boots, but not new. Flint was between them, not barking because Flint did not bark, standing with his weight forward, ears flat, a low continuous sound coming from his throat that Hattie had learned to read as the difference between animal passing through and human not expected. "Good afternoon," Dalton said. He smiled. It was a wide smile, the kind that fills the entire face, and there was a practice in it that told her it was a smile used often and with purpose. "You must be Mrs. Calder." "I am. My name is Dalton Briggs." He paused after the name, the kind of pause people make when they expect the name to mean something. "I was a friend of Walter's, old friend." She let the silence last 1 second longer than was comfortable before responding. "I know who you are," she said. That caught him. Not much. He was a man accustomed to recalibration, but enough that the smile adjusted by a fraction before resetting. He sat on the boulder she indicated. She remained standing, not from discourtesy, from advantage. Standing gave her mobility, control of distance, and the quiet authority that sitting away surrenders. Flint positioned himself beside her, his flank touching her ankle. Dalton made his case. The land had a complicated legal situation. 3 co-owners, one of them, Everett, had already formalized the sale of his share. A mining company was interested in acquiring the whole parcel. The offer was generous, above market, life-changing for a woman in her situation. He could facilitate the negotiation. Simple, quick. She listened the way she had learned to listen during 30 years of parent-teacher conferences, where the words being said were never the whole story. She mapped his assumptions. He assumed she knew nothing about the history. He assumed the word complicated would frighten her. He assumed a woman alone in a cabin without electricity would respond to a large number, with the particular mixture of relief and greed that makes people sign things without reading. He was wrong on all 3. "You said Everett sold his share," she said. "Is that registered?" The question was not what he expected. He recovered quickly, but the recovery itself was information. "It is all documented," he said, with a vagueness that answered without answering. "I will verify at the clerk's office," she said. "When I have verified, we can talk about proposals." His smile thinned. "How much time do you need?" "What I need," she said. He descended the trail. Flint watched until the distant sound of a truck engine faded entirely. Then he looked at Hattie with an expression she did not try to translate, but understood. She went to the clerk's office the next morning. Opal was in her usual place. When she saw Hattie enter, she set the pen down before finishing her line, which told Hattie the visit was expected. "I need to verify whether a transfer of Everett Poole's share in the Briar Ridge joint registration has been recorded," Hattie said. Opal did not reach for the ledger immediately. She looked at Hattie with that measuring expression. Then she spoke with a precision of language that Hattie understood was intentional. "There was an attempted registration. The document presented contained formal irregularities. The signature of Everett Poole lacked proper notarization, and the instrument of transfer included a clause that contradicted the terms of the original joint registration." She paused. "I did not register it." Hattie sat down without being invited because her legs needed a moment. The individual who presented the document was dissatisfied. Opal continued. "He indicated he would return with corrected documentation. That was 8 months ago. And did he return? He did not. The sale of Everett's share was not registered." What Dalton had told her about the company already being a co-owner was not true, or at least was not legally true. The entire architecture of his argument, that polished presentation of the situation, is already moving forward. And you are the last piece, was built on a foundation that did not exist. Hattie requested a certified statement of the current registration status. Opal issued it, signed it, stamped it, delivered it with her usual efficiency. Then she looked at Hattie over her glasses with the closest expression to warmth Hattie had seen from her. Your husband was a careful man. He did well to keep what he kept. Hattie carried the certified statement up the ridge and placed it in the plastic folder with the other documents. She called the Denver lawyer. She told him about the attempted registration and about Dalton's visit. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said the unregistered status changed things in her favor. Any argument Dalton made, based on the company already being a co-owner, had no legal foundation at present. That evening, she sat outside on the flat rock near the cabin with a bowl of rice and beans and the last light of the day, turning the granite the color of warm bread. Flint lay beside her, his chin on his front paws, eyes half closed in that state of watchful rest that was not sleep, but was peace. The garlic in the southeast plot had pushed up another inch. She could see the green lines from where she sat, thin and exact, like a sentence someone was writing in the soil. She was beginning to understand what it meant to be in a place, not because you had nowhere else to go, but because the place itself was teaching you things you could not learn anywhere else. The ridge did not care about her history. It did not care about the will or the gold or the legal dispute or the man with the practiced smile. It cared about weather and water and season and root depth. And within that indifference was a kind of respect she had not found in any human arrangement since Walter died. Then winter came early. The first sign was the wind changing direction 2 days before the snow arrived, swinging from its usual westerly pattern to a hard push from the north that came down from the peaks, with a sound she had not heard before on the ridge, deeper, more sustained, carrying a cold that was not the familiar cold of autumn evenings, but something with weight behind it, something with intention. She opened the notebook to the section about winter. Walter had written it in his most detailed hand, as though he knew this was the part that mattered most. November storm comes fast from the north. 2 days warning from the wind. Board the east window from outside. Move firewood inside enough for 4 days minimum. Fill every container from both springs. The north trail will ice over first. Do not use it during active snowfall. She worked for the 2 days the wind gave her. Cut and stacked firewood inside the cabin until there was barely room to move. Filled the bucket and every pot and jar she had from both springs. Covered the east window with the plastic sheeting she had used for wall gaps, securing it with rocks and rope. She moved the food stores to the highest shelf away from any water that might come through the floor gaps. The snow arrived on the third morning with a silence that was more unsettling than any wind. She woke to a world that had gone white and still. The kind of still that means the air itself has stopped moving, and everything is holding its breath. Then the wind returned, and the storm became what mountain storms become at elevation, not weather, but event. A thing with force and duration that makes the distinction between inside and outside feel less like architecture and more like negotiation. The roof leaked in 2 places she had not anticipated. The wind found gaps she thought she had sealed. The temperature inside the cabin dropped to a point where her breath was visible even with the fire going. She and Flint occupied a space no larger than a closet near the stove she had built from stacked stones and a piece of salvage metal, feeding it with the wood she had stored, rationing the supply against a storm whose duration she could not predict. She read the notebook by firelight, page by page in order through the sections about water management and soil and trail conditions and the behavior of animals before weather changes. Walter's voice came through the handwriting with a steadiness that felt in the howling dark of that cabin like the most intimate conversation they had ever had. He had written these words sitting in this same space, perhaps during a storm like this one, knowing that the person who would most need them was not yet here. On the second day, a section of the south wall bowed inward under the weight of drifted snows. She braced it with the shelf board and two rocks and her own shoulder, while Flint pressed against her legs with a warmth that was not comfort, but was presence, which was enough. On the third day, the fire nearly went out. She had miscounted the wood. There were 4 pieces left, and the storm had not broken. She sat in the near dark with the ember glow, the only light, and Flint curled against her side. And she made a list in her head because there was not enough light to write. What I have, what I need, what I can do with what I have. The list was short, but it was a list, and list had never failed her. Not because they changed the facts, but because they made the facts small enough to hold. On the 4th morning, the wind stopped. The silence that followed was so complete that she thought for a moment she had gone deaf. Then she heard the drip of melting snow from the eaves and knew it was over. She opened the door against a drift that came to her waist. The world outside was white and blue and so bright after 4 days of dimness that her eyes watered. The ridge looked like a different planet, every familiar shape buried or transformed. The boulders wearing white caps, the trail invisible. The aspens bent under the weight of ice. Ada Birch arrived before noon, climbing the trail with a rope tied around her waist and a pot of soup in her pack. She did not say anything dramatic. She looked at the cabin, looked at Hattie, standing in the doorway with 4 days of survival written on her face, and held out the pot. "Brought soup," Ada said. "Figured you might be low on firewood, too." Her nephew was behind her on the trail with a bundle of split pine on his back. Hattie took the soup. She wanted to say something that matched the size of what she felt, but what she said was thank you. And what she meant was everything. And Ada understood both because she was the kind of woman who listened to what people meant rather than what they said. That evening, after the fire was rebuilt and the soup was eaten, and Ada and her nephew had gone back down, Hattie sat in the cabin with the notebook open to the page about November storms. Walter had written at the bottom of the section in smaller letters, as though it were an afterthought, but was not. The ridge tests you in winter. Not to break you, to show you what you are made of. If you are still here in spring, you belong here. She closed the notebook, placed her hand flat on the cover the way she had seen Opal place her hand on the ledger, as though the weight of the palm could communicate something to the pages underneath. Flint was lying beside the stove, dry now, fed, is breathing the slow rhythm of an animal that has survived something and is resting fully for the first time in days. Then she heard it, not a sound from outside, a sound from inside her coat pocket, the crinkle of paper. She reached in and found a note from Fenton that she had carried since before the storm and had not had time to read in the chaos of preparation. She unfolded it. Fenton's square handwriting on the back of another receipt. Briggs came back, stood at the bottom of the road looking up at the ridge for 30 minutes, did not come into town, drove away. Also, letter arrived for you from a law office in Denver, holding it here. She read it twice. Then she folded it and placed it in the notebook between Walter's last written page and the blank pages that followed. The storm had tested her, and she was still here. The ridge had shown her what she was made of, and what she was made of had been enough. But outside the circle of firelight in a dark truck that watched ridgelines, the way a man watches something he intends to take the other test was still coming. She pulled the blanket around her shoulders. Flint shifted, pressing his warm flank closer. The fire cracked once and settled, and the blank pages of the notebook lay open beside her, waiting for whatever she would write next, though she did not yet know what that would be, only that the pen was hers now, and the ridge for the moment was quiet. She did not go to Nebraska immediately. She went because she needed to, but before going she organized what she was leaving behind, because that was a principle she had absorbed from Walter, without him ever having to teach it directly. She saw it in the way he worked, in the way he never left a site without securing the essentials. It is not perfectionism. It is the practical recognition that when you travel far to retrieve something, you need to know that what you left will still be standing when you return. She spent 2 days preparing. Ada Birch's nephew, a quiet 17-year-old named Colton, who showed up when asked and did not need to be told things twice, agreed to come up the ridge once a day to tend the chickens she had acquired through Fenton's network, and to water the garden, which was now producing kale and onions alongside the garlic. She walked him through the routine, where the feed was stored, how to check the spring basin, which rows needed water daily, and which could hold for a day without. Flint was the harder matter, not because he could not manage on his own. He knew the ridge better than any human who had ever set foot on it. The difficulty was that he did not understand temporary. When she packed her bag that Thursday morning, he stood at the door with the posture she knew weight forward ears up ready. She knelt and placed her hand on his head and said the word they had established. Stay. He stayed. But he watched her descend the trail with the fixedness that accompanied her down the mountain and onto the bus and across 4 state lines into a landscape she had never seen. The bus ride was long. She changed twice in terminals whose names she forgot as the terrain shifted from the sharp verticals of Colorado to the broad rolling openness of the Great Plains. She watched the land change through the window the way she watched everything now, with the particular attention of a woman who had learned that looking carefully was never wasted. The rhythm of the bus, the changing light, the silence inside a long-distance coach when most passengers were sleeping, all of it organized her thoughts in ways she did not try to control. She thought about what she knew of Everett Poole. Walter described him in the notebook as a man who was good underneath but weak when pressed. Not cowardly because there was a difference. The kind of person who gives in not because he wants to, but because the weight of resistance feels heavier than the cost of giving in. That kind of person often regrets afterward when the real cost of what he surrendered becomes visible. And that regret can be a door, if you come through the right entrance. There was a line Walter had written about Everett that she had read several times. Everett is not the enemy. He is a man who was afraid at the wrong moment. If you ever need him, come with patience. He responds to patience. Patience she had. It was the one resource that had never run out, even when everything else was gone. She arrived in the small Nebraska city where Everett's brother lived on a Friday afternoon. Found the address through the county clerk's office there. The same method that worked in Ridge Rock, because county clerks in small places are the memory of the land. And if you come with a full name and honest purpose, they will help you find what you are looking for. The property was a small farm well kept at the end of 6 miles of dirt road off the state highway. She walked the 6 miles because there was no other option, and because flat dirt road in mild weather was a different scale of effort from the ridge trail in winter. A yellow dog barked from the porch for a few seconds, and then came to smell her ankle with the disarming curiosity of an animal that had not been taught to distrust. A man of about 70 appeared at the door, tall, thin, with deep-set eyes and the narrowed face of someone who had lived a long time in open sun. She introduced herself, stated her connection, Walter Calder's widow, the property on Briar Ridge. She needed to speak with Everett if possible. The man studied her for a long moment. It was not hostility. It was the careful measurement of someone who had seen trouble arrive by road before and had learned to identify the difference between a visit and a problem. Walter passed away, she said. Anticipating what he needed confirmed. Over 3 years ago now. The property came to me. He nodded once. Wait here, he said, and went inside. Everett Poole was 58 years old and carried every one of those years not in his face, which was relatively preserved, but in his shoulders, which had the particular curve of a man who had spent too long carrying guilt or worry or both. He was shorter than the photograph had suggested. His eyes were dark and quick. The eyes of someone who observes before acting, similar to Walter in that respect. Different in that Walter's eyes had steadiness, and Everett's had the quality of someone always checking for the nearest exit. He appeared on the porch and looked at her before descending the 2 steps. Stood there for a moment, and as if verifying whether the person he was about to face was the kind of problem that could be managed or the kind that could not. She opened her hands, palms visible. Not submission, information. I did not come to fight. I came to talk. He descended. Mrs. Calder, he said. It was not a question. He already knew. They sat on a wooden bench under a cottonwood tree whose leaves moved with a lazy indifference to the seriousness of the conversation below. His brother had disappeared with the tact of an older sibling who understands when to leave the room. She told him what she knew, the same order and clarity she had used with the lawyer. Not more than necessary, not less than sufficient. The joint registration still showing 3 original owners. The attempted transfer that Opal had refused. The certified statement. Walter's notebook and letter. Dalton's visit to the cabin and his claim that Everett's share was already sold. Everett listened without interrupting once. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. The yellow dog had moved from the porch to lie at Everett's feet, chin on his boot with the familiarity of daily ritual. You signed a promise of sale, she said. Not as accusation, as fact. He breathed in through his nose, closed his eyes for a moment. 2 years ago, he said. Dalton told me Walter had already agreed. Said it was just a formality that the deal was moving forward. And if I did not sign, I would lose the payout because the company would not wait. He stopped, passed his hand over his face. I was in a bad stretch. Debt, family health problems. The number he put in front of me was large. He paused again, bitter and small, and I believed him. Walter never agreed to anything, Hattie said. I know that now. Found out when I tried to reach Walter afterward to confirm. He told me he had never heard of any formal offer. Your signature was not registered, Hattie said. The attempted filing was rejected for formal irregularities. Dalton told you it was all settled. It was not settled. She watched something move through Everett's face that she needed a moment to identify. It was not surprise. It was relief. The specific relief of a man who has carried a weight for too long and suddenly learns the weight is not as permanent as he believed. It was not registered. He repeated more to himself than to her. No. Dalton told me it was done. Told me it was just a matter of time before the sale closed, and I would receive the amount we agreed on. Hattie let the silence hold. She did not fill it with commentary or judgment. There was a pain in this man that was his, and it did not need her validation or her correction. It needed room. What do you want from me? He asked. Direct. She received it the way it was given. I want to know if you want out of this situation in a way that is good for you. I am not here to force anything or promise what I cannot deliver. If you want to sell your share someday, that is your right, and I can help make sure any future transaction protects you, not Dalton, not the company, you. If you do not want to sell, that is also your right. He looked at her for a time. She let run. And Dalton, he said. Dalton will keep trying, but without your third and without mine, he cannot force anything. Each of us alone is vulnerable. Together, the situation is different. She stayed another hour. His brother came out with coffee and biscuits, placed them on the low table, and went back inside. Everett told her about the 2 years since he signed, the waiting for money that never came. The calls from Dalton that grew less frequent as it became clear the registration had not gone through the growing sense that he had been used in a way he could not fully articulate without also accepting responsibility for his own credulity. She listened. Not the passive listening that waits for a turn to speak. The active listening that makes a person feel the weight of what they are saying is being received with the weight it deserves. When she was preparing to leave, Everett said something she did not expect. Walter chose well. She did not know how to respond. She held the silence for a few seconds, and he must have thought it was a problem with the distance between them. But what it was the particular difficulty of receiving a compliment that is actually a statement about someone who is no longer here to hear it. He wrote about you with care, she said. I thought you should know that. Something crossed his face that she did not try to name. There are things that belong to the person feeling them, and translation is not always necessary or welcome. Thank you, he said quietly. She walked back to the highway in the late afternoon light of the plains, which was wider and flatter and more golden than any light she knew from the ridge, but which carried its own kind of beauty. The beauty of openness of land that has nothing to hide because there is nowhere to hide it. 3 weeks later, Fenton passed along a message Everett had called. She went down to the payphone that afternoon. The conversation lasted 8 minutes. Everett had consulted his own lawyer. The promise of sale contained an expiration clause. The deadline for completing the transaction had been 18 months from the date of signing. 26 months had passed. The document was void. I am not selling Hattie, he said. It was the first time he used only her name. Not now, not like this. If I ever sell it will be on my terms, not because Dalton pushed me into it. You have that right, she said. Are you going to stay up there? He asked. I am. Silence for a moment. Then he said quietly, almost to himself, Walter always said that ridge was special. She responded to the formal purchase offer from Dalton's lawyer within the 10-day window he had set. The Denver lawyer drafted the refusal, citing the current market valuation, the protected status of her co-ownership interest, and the well-documented history of resistance to coercive acquisition attempts. The letter was precise and final. The mining company, facing 2 refusals and no path to full acquisition, redirected its operations to a different parcel in the county. The market works with multiple options simultaneously, the Denver lawyer explained, and does not invest in prolonged legal disputes over properties that can be replaced by others of simpler acquisition. Dalton went quiet, the kind of quiet that could mean surrender or regrouping, and the only sensible response to either was to continue doing what she had been doing before. So she continued. Spring came to Briar Ridge the way everything came to that place, physically, concretely, without announcement. The aspens on the southeast slope leafed out first, a green, so new and so vivid, it looked like the color had been invented that morning, specifically for those trees. The garlic pushed up in its neat rows in the southeast plot, darker and stronger than anything she had expected from soil she had been told was too shallow and too rocky to grow anything worth harvesting. Ada examined the bulbs at the market with the attention of a specialist and said one word that, coming from Ada, was significant praise. Good. She began trading surplus eggs for things she did not produce. Cheese from a neighbor in the valley who kept goats. Flour from Ada, who milled her own and traded it gladly for eggs because her husband had cholesterol, and she preferred to cook without butter when she could. Fenton once accepted a dozen eggs as partial payment for a shipment of kerosene, with an expression that was not exactly a smile, but was the closest equivalent his face permitted. It was on an afternoon in late April, with the last of the winter's grip finally releasing, and the warmth returning in waves, that the granite absorbed with what she could only describe as gratitude that she went back to the cavity. She had not been inside since before the storm. There was a part of her that had been avoiding the space, not from fear, not from superstition, but from something harder to name. The way you avoid rereading a letter you already know by heart, because rereading it will bring the feelings back to the surface. and you are not sure you are ready for the surface. She removed the wallboards with movements. Her hands performed without instruction. Entered with the headlamp she had traded for at the autumn market. Sat on the cold stone at the back. Everything was as she had left it. The metal box, the tools in their cloth wrapping, the photographs pinned to the stone wall. She took down the third photograph, the one that showed her from behind, standing on a dirt road, shoulders curved forward, head tilted to one side. She held it under the light and looked at it for a long time. The woman in the photograph did not know she was being seen, did not know the image would travel to a hidden space inside a mountain and wait there for years, did not know that one day she would sit in that same space holding that same image, trying to measure the distance between who she was then and who she had become. She could not see the woman's face, only the back, the shoulders, the tilt of the head. The posture of someone resisting, not winning, not losing, resisting. And Walter had seen that and kept it as though it were the most important thing he possessed. Not the land, not the gold, not the agreement with 3 signatures. The image of a woman enduring. She pinned the photograph back on the stone wall, ran her hand along the cold rock the way she had done before, in that gesture that had become familiar without being planned. Then she spoke quietly to the silence of the cavity, which was the only listener available. "I understand," she said. "It took me a while, but I understand." There was no answer. Of course there was no answer. But there was the specific weight of a silence that is not empty, and she had learned the difference between the two during these months. Empty silence sounds like absence. Full silence sounds like a presence that no longer needs words. She left the cavity, replaced the boards, went outside and stood at the boulder perimeter where she had stood dozens of times before, looking down at the valley. But this time she did not sit. She stood straight, her shoulders back, her head level, not tilted, not curved forward, not the posture of resistance, the posture of choice. The valley below was green with spring. Ridge Rock's rooftops caught the afternoon light. The dirt road that descended from the ridge wound through the aspens in curves. She now knew by heart every loose stone, every section where the sun arrived first, and the section that stayed in shadow until late morning. Flint sat beside her, looking at the valley with the calm gaze of an animal that regards the landscape not as scenery, but as territory. His territory. Hers. She went inside. The cabin was warm with the residual heat of the afternoon sun on the stone walls. The shelf was organized with jars of dried herbs and containers of grain. The garden tools leaned against the wall near the door. The plastic folder with the documents sat in its designated place, and the notebook lay on the shelf where she had kept it since deciding it was a document for use, not for hiding. She opened it to the last page Walter had written, the handwriting that she knew as well as her own. The final entry registered. Split 3 ways, 1/3 each. Wait. After that, blank pages. Many of them. She picked up the pencil that lay beside the notebook, held it for a moment. Then she wrote in her own hand, not the small left-leaning script of a left-handed man, but her own steady and slightly wide. The handwriting her mother used to say looked like it belonged to a woman who was not afraid to take up space. First spring, garlic came up in rows. First thing I planted in this soil came out good. She closed the notebook, set the pencil beside it, went to the door and opened it. The iron latch resisted the way it always did, and then yielded the way it always did to the sideways pressure she had learned was required. Outside, the light was doing what light does on Briar Ridge in late April, falling at an angle that turned the granite gold and the aspen silver and the valley below into something that looked like a painting someone had made of a place they loved too much to render accurately, so they just painted the feeling instead. She stood in the doorway. Flint rose from his spot on the warm stone and came to stand beside her, pressing his flank lightly against her leg. The spring that she could hear but not see from here ran somewhere below. On the north side, steady and continuous the way they had run before any of them arrived, and would run after all of them were gone. She thought about Calvin. She did that sometimes without warning, without a specific trigger beyond the quietness that allows certain things to surface. She thought about him with the pain that does not diminish, but that over time you learn to carry differently. Not because it hurts less, but because you grow stronger around it. The way the ridge grows around the cabin without eliminating the structure inside. She thought about Walter, who had seen her from behind on a dirt road and recognized something in her posture that she had not recognized in herself, and had carried that recognition to a hidden place and kept it for years as proof that the woman he loved was stronger than she knew. She thought about the list she had made, all of them, the ones on paper and the ones in her head, and the one she was making now without writing it down. Because this list did not need paper. It was short and it was simple and it was the only list that had ever mattered. What I have, what I chose, what I am. The wind came through the ridge with a softness that was unusual for this time of day. It carried the smell of pine resin and wet stone and the first wildflowers of the season. Small purple things growing in the cracks between boulders. Boulders too small to have names that anyone used but too alive to go unnoticed. Flint leaned into her leg. She placed her hand on his back. The valley below settled into the long, slow exhale of a spring evening. The light thickening the shadows, reaching east, the first stars appearing in the part of the sky that had already let go of the sun. Sometimes life takes you to places that look like the end of everything. A crooked cabin between stones. An inheritance nobody wanted. A silence that feels at first like abandonment. But with time and work and attention and the willingness to listen to what a place has to say, you discover that some of those places were prepared, not by luck, not by destiny, which is a word she never learned to use without suspicion, by the quiet love of someone who knew you well enough to know you would only understand when you arrived, and by your own capacity to continue, which you were never entirely sure you had till you needed it. She had stayed. And staying on that particular ridge in that particular life she was learning to call her own was not giving up on something else. It was choosing this. And that choice, she discovered, was the most whole thing she had made in many years. If this story reminded you of someone who once quietly prepared a path for you, without needing to explain why, someone whose love showed up not in words, but in what they built and what they kept and what they left behind for you to find who was that person. And have you told them or told their memory that you finally understand?